The Trump administration, desperate for a foreign policy victory, is turning its attention to Venezuela. After facing strategic setbacks with global powers, Venezuela is seen as the low-hanging fruit to be toppled. The world watches with apprehension. Is the denial of war merely a tactic to lull the population to sleep before the conflict actually happens? Tension is escalating with the mobilization of aircraft carriers filled with F/A-18 Hornets and F-35s, and the presence of forward operating bases in Trinidad and Tobago and Puerto Rico. Washington's official narrative, which points to Venezuelan military facilities for allegedly smuggling narcotics as potential targets, is viewed with deep skepticism. The history of the Trump administration shows a pattern of using negotiations and denials as a weapon, as seen in the cases of Gaza and Iran. The risk of a war in Venezuela is imminent and could arrive very soon, following the historical pattern of U.S. intervention against governments it dislikes in Latin America. This detailed script will not only narrate the events in real time, but also unravel the complex layers underpinning this crisis. We will analyze why Venezuela, despite sanctions, is not an easy target, highlighting its oil wealth, the preparation of its militias, and the support of its allies. We will investigate the role of Russia, China, and Iran, and how their military and commercial support is strengthening the country's defense. And crucially, we will evaluate the consequences of an attack, remembering that modern U.S. warfare often relies on the destruction of civilian infrastructure under military pretexts, a tactic aimed at subjugating the population. We will add to this analysis the dimension of hybrid warfare, exploring the devastating impact of economic sanctions and the growing importance of cyber warfare in the conflict. Prepare to understand the true reason why the Trump administration is targeting Venezuela. It is in essence the pursuit of a geopolitical victory in the Western Hemisphere to compensate for setbacks on other fronts. It is a move that forces the international community to question the credibility of Washington's war denials. Join us in this in-depth analysis to unravel the complexities of this critical moment, where rhetoric has materialized into troop movements and the drums of war resonate in the Caribbean. The massive buildup of U.S. troops and military assets near Venezuela is not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a strategy of pressure and possible regime change. This move represents a direct challenge to Venezuela's sovereignty and regional stability, with the South American country being seen as an easier target after the difficulty of confronting Russia and China. Reports indicate a massive buildup of American troops, with aircraft carriers filled with F/A-18 Hornets and F-35s. Military readiness is being established throughout the region, with forward operating bases in Trinidad and Tobago, which Venezuela has criticized as a forward operating base for a potential regime change operation, and Puerto Rico, where F-35 fighters are stationed. The strategic threat is clear. The U.S. is positioning assets for an air and naval attack operation. Potential targets under consideration are military-controlled airports and ports, including airstrips and naval facilities, citing a U.S. official. The pretext is that these facilities are used for narcotics smuggling. The official denial by Donald Trump and Marco Rubio that an attack will occur must be viewed with extreme skepticism. The Trump administration has a history of using denial and negotiations as a weapon to disarm public vigilance. The administration allegedly brokered a ceasefire, but simultaneously approved long-range strikes or allowed Israel to constantly break the agreement, even attempting to assassinate negotiators during the talks. The U.S. spent months threatening the Iranian government under the nuclear pretext, claiming Iran was weeks away from a nuclear weapon. They then engaged in talks but used the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, as a Mossad agent to spy on Iran and time a surprise Israeli strike. The lesson is clear. Nothing the Trump administration says can be trusted. The denial of war is a way to make people fall asleep when the war actually happens. The deployment of fighters and the installation of military bases are not done for fun, but to prepare the ground for a conflict. Venezuela is not the easy target that the U.S. foreign policy establishment might think. Venezuela is the world's most oil-rich country, and despite sanctions that have decimated its economy, has managed to maintain its sovereignty. Nicolas Maduro is engaged in a massive campaign to arm militias inside Venezuela to defend the country from any U.S. incursion. The argument is that if Maduro were so unpopular, he would not arm people who could turn against him, suggesting significant popular support. Venezuela is an incredibly difficult place to fight a conventional war due to its size, terrain, urban centers, and tropical forests. The U.S. needs unconventional and asymmetric warfare, but the Venezuelan opposition is not popular enough to be an effective proxy. Venezuela's resistance is strengthened by a support network of global powers seeking to challenge U.S. hegemony: Russia, China, and Iran. This resistance manifests not only in the military field, but also in the dimension of hybrid warfare. Despite criticism about the extent of the aid, the military and economic support from Venezuela's allies is a crucial factor in deterrence. Reports confirm the landing of a heavy Russian cargo plane, Ilyushin Il-76, capable of carrying 50 tons of cargo or 200 people, in Caracas. The aircraft, linked to the former Wagner mercenary group, took a circuitous route via Armenia, Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Mauritania to avoid Western airspace. This suggests the delivery of small arms, military supplies, and possibly mercenaries. There are rumors that S-400 air defense systems might be on the way, although Venezuela already possesses Russian-made Su-35 fighters and S-300 systems. The military and commercial relationship is very close, with Iran providing advanced drones and technology. Trade between the two sanctioned countries, including Iranian markets in Caracas, helps alleviate economic pressures. Leaked U.S. documents, to be treated with caution, indicate that Maduro requested assistance from Russia, China, and Iran, including radar systems, missile support, and aircraft repairs. China is described as an all-weather partner of Venezuela. The threat to Venezuela is not just military but also manifests in forms of hybrid warfare, where the economy and cyberspace are battlegrounds. The Maduro government accused the U.S. of being behind the 2019 national blackout, which paralyzed the country, suggesting a clandestine CIA cyber attack. In response, Russia sent cybersecurity teams to help the Maduro regime protect its critical infrastructure. This transforms Venezuela into a stage for digital confrontation between powers. U.S.-led sanctions represent a form of economic warfare with devastating consequences. It is estimated that sanctions cost Venezuela the loss of $226 billion in oil revenue, equivalent to 213% of its GDP. Furthermore, the humanitarian impact is undeniable, with studies linking sanctions to over 40,000 deaths due to shortages of medicine and food. Venezuela is a target for three main reasons. Political economic system. Since 1998, with Hugo Chavez, Venezuela nationalized its oil and attempted to redistribute wealth to fund social projects. Millions of homes built, a system that is anathema to what the U.S. desires, a subservient government. 2. Control of oil. Control of Venezuelan oil would allow the U.S. to manipulate the global market and strengthen the dollar system, using it as a geopolitical tool. 3. Multipolarity. Venezuela is a crucial focal point to break multipolarity in Latin America, being one of the few countries, along with Cuba and Brazil under Lula, attempting to chart a course independent of U.S. foreign policy. The possibility of a war in Venezuela is a calculated risk, but with potentially catastrophic consequences for the fragile U.S. empire. The battle for the narrative is as important as the battle on the ground. Establishment sources, like the Christian Science Monitor, admit that a ground war would not be quick and easy. Troop estimates. Military experts estimate that between 50,000 and 200,000 U.S. troops would be needed for a ground war. Lack of support. There is no appetite for death among American troops on Venezuelan soil. Challenging terrain. The terrain, urban centers, tropical forests, and the presence of armed militias make ground warfare extremely challenging. The U.S. empire is described as very fragile and very sensitive at this time. Global setbacks. The conflict in Ukraine exposed military weaknesses. The genocide in Gaza obliterated its global credibility, and China is growing exponentially. Political risk. The Trump administration cannot afford a ground war, as it would lead to a complete loss in the midterm elections and delegitimize the MAGA movement. The point of no return. What happens if a U.S. F-35 fighter jet or destroyer is shot down or sunk? The empire cannot handle this politically. This would lead to total escalation, market collapse, and an unsustainable political situation. Modern warfare is fought both on the physical battlefield and in the field of public perception. The U.S. is transforming Venezuela into a Cold War site, with crude and ineffective innuendos, like linking Venezuela to Hezbollah or fentanyl smuggling, to justify intervention. The Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Maria Corina Machado, a Venezuelan opposition figure, is an example of how the propaganda machine is being used to legitimize the opposition and external pressure. The phenomenon of disinformation is exacerbated in Venezuela, where the lack of public data and polarization lead both the government and the opposition to use fake news to manipulate public opinion. It is more likely that the U.S. will opt for airstrikes, with F-18 Hornets and cruise missiles, against command and control centers, aiming to subjugate the population. However, this tactic can have the opposite effect: regional unity. If the U.S. bombs and creates a quagmire in Venezuela, the entire Latin American region will unite more than ever against the U.S. empire, despite the current political situation being very difficult, with subservient regimes in Ecuador and even Bolivia. A war in Venezuela, if it occurs, will be a difficult and risky conflict. The low-hanging fruit strategy may turn into a geopolitical quagmire. The crisis forces the U.S. to redefine its security doctrine, recognizing that the war in Venezuela will not be a quick victory. The future of global security depends on how Washington manages this crisis, where lies and denial are the first weapons of war, and hybrid warfare, economic and cyber, is already in full swing. Humanitarian consequences. The destruction of civilian infrastructure under military pretexts is a tactic aimed at subjugating the population, but which results in a humanitarian disaster. Economic impact. The loss of $226 billion in oil revenue due to sanctions and the associated 40,000 deaths demonstrate that economic warfare is already underway and is lethal. Cyber warfare. The presence of Russian cybersecurity teams and accusations of CIA attacks show that Venezuela's critical infrastructure is an active target in the conflict. The legacy of the crisis. The pursuit of an easy victory exposes the fragility of the U.S. empire and the risk of a confrontation with global powers. The end of the illusion of security. The crisis in Venezuela is a reminder that U.S. security is not incontestable. The pursuit of low-hanging fruit can lead to a confrontation with global powers, forcing the U.S. into a painful re-evaluation of its regional primacy. The crisis in the Caribbean is the harbinger of a more dangerous and unpredictable world. The need for a diplomatic solution and the risk of error. Despite the military escalation, the only safe way out is diplomacy. However, the Trump administration uses negotiations as a tactic of war. The risk of a miscalculation or a lie turning into war is what keeps the world on edge. The last line of defense. Venezuela's preparation. Venezuela's preparation, including the arming of militias and the support of its allies, is the last line of defense. The success or failure of the U.S. incursion will depend on Venezuela's capacity for resistance and the willingness of its allies to intervene. The crisis in the Caribbean is a test of the U.S.'s ability to deal with a threat that is not low-hanging fruit. Historical context, the Monroe Doctrine, and the history of interventions. The current crisis cannot be understood without the context of the Monroe Doctrine and the long history of U.S. interventions in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed in 1823, established Latin America as the U.S. sphere of influence, justifying countless military and political interventions to protect American interests and combat foreign ideologies like communism. In the case of Venezuela, the U.S. supported the military dictatorship of Pérez Jiménez, 1951-1958, and, more recently, was involved in the attempted coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002. The current pressure on the Maduro government is, therefore, the continuation of a long-standing policy of regional domination, now rebranded under the rhetoric of restoring democracy. The role of the Venezuelan opposition and international legitimacy. The Venezuelan opposition, led by figures like Juan Guaidó and Maria Corina Machado, has been a fundamental instrument in the U.S. pressure strategy. The recognition of Guaidó as interim president by dozens of countries, although it did not result in a transition of power, served to isolate the Maduro government and justify sanctions. The awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Machado is another step in this strategy of legitimizing the opposition, presenting it as a democratic and peaceful alternative while, behind the scenes, the military threat and economic warfare continue. However, the lack of unity and limited popular support for the opposition within Venezuela continue to be a significant obstacle to U.S. regime change plans. The implications for the global energy market. An intervention in Venezuela would have profound implications for the global energy market. Venezuela possesses the world's largest oil reserves, and a war or even an escalation of sanctions could lead to a significant disruption in supply, resulting in a sharp increase in oil prices. Although the U.S. has increased its own oil production in recent years, the global market remains sensitive to supply shocks. Furthermore, control of Venezuela's vast reserves would give the U.S. a powerful geopolitical lever, allowing it to influence prices and pressure other producing countries. China, one of the world's largest energy consumers and an important commercial partner of Venezuela, would be particularly affected by such a scenario, which adds another layer of geopolitical complexity to the crisis. The human factor, the refugee crisis and regional impact. The economic and political crisis in Venezuela has already resulted in one of the world's largest displacements of people, with over 7 million Venezuelans leaving the country. A military intervention would drastically exacerbate this refugee crisis, with millions more seeking refuge in neighboring countries, such as Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. These countries are already struggling to cope with the refugee flow, and a sudden increase in the number of people crossing their borders could lead to a humanitarian crisis of catastrophic proportions. The resulting social and political instability could spread throughout the region, creating a vicious cycle of conflict and displacement. The human dimension of the crisis is often underestimated in geopolitical calculations, but the consequences of a war in Venezuela would be felt by millions of people across Latin America. The international community's response and U.S. isolation. Despite the support of some allies, the U.S. maximum pressure policy against Venezuela has not been universally accepted. Many countries, including members of the European Union and Latin American nations, have advocated for a diplomatic solution and opposed military intervention. A unilateral U.S. action could lead to greater isolation of Washington on the world stage, undermining its credibility and leadership. Russia and China, in turn, have seized the opportunity to present themselves as defenders of sovereignty and international law, strengthening their ties with countries that oppose U.S. hegemony. The crisis in Venezuela, therefore, is not just a confrontation between the U.S. and a small Latin American country, but a battlefield in a larger struggle for the world order. Threats to critical infrastructure and unconventional warfare. The threat of U.S. airstrikes is not limited to military targets. The U.S. unconventional warfare strategy, often copied from Israel's playbook, targets civilian critical infrastructure under the pretext of being dual-use targets. This includes power plants, bridges, and communication centers. The goal is to paralyze the country and break the population's will to resist. Venezuela, with its infrastructure already weakened by sanctions, is particularly vulnerable to this type of attack, which could lead to a total collapse of basic services, such as health and water. The China factor. Debt and strategic partnership. China is a massive creditor to Venezuela, with billions of dollars in loans guaranteed by oil. A U.S. intervention that destabilizes Venezuela would put these Chinese investments at risk. China therefore has a direct economic interest in the stability of the Maduro regime and the continuity of oil supply. The Sino-Venezuelan partnership is not just commercial, it is strategic. China sees Venezuela as a crucial foothold in its long-term strategy to challenge U.S. hegemony in Latin America and promote a multipolar world. Chinese support, which includes the supply of surveillance and telecommunications technology, is a vital counterweight to Western pressure. The legacy of Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. The Maduro government's resistance is the direct continuation of the Bolivarian Revolution initiated by Hugo Chavez in 1998. The Chavista project focused on oil nationalization, wealth redistribution, and national sovereignty is the main reason for U.S. hostility. The underlying ideology is that of an alternative development model that rejects neoliberalism and subordination to American interests. The attempted coup against Chavez in 2002, supported by the U.S., and the subsequent popular resistance that restored him to power are a reminder that the struggle in Venezuela is deeply ideological and has historical roots in the pursuit of self-determination. Trump's unpredictability and the risk of miscalculation The unpredictability of former President Trump is a significant risk factor. His willingness to disregard the foreign policy establishment and make unilateral decisions increases the chance of a miscalculation that could lead to an uncontrolled escalation. The denial of war, combined with the increased military presence, creates a scenario of uncertainty where the line between rhetoric and military action is dangerously thin. The international community is on high alert, knowing that a single error in judgment by Washington could trigger a regional conflict. Regional unity as the last line of defense. Despite political divisions in Latin America, the threat of a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela has the potential to force regional unity. The history of U.S. interventions is a unifying factor for many countries that value sovereignty. If the U.S. proceeds with an attack, it could galvanize regional support for Maduro and lead to widespread international condemnation, further isolating Washington. The crisis in Venezuela is, ironically, the greatest opportunity for Latin America to reaffirm its independence and build a regional security architecture that does not depend on U.S. hegemony. The future of deterrence and the New World Order. The crisis in Venezuela is a microcosm of the struggle for the New World Order. Maduro's resistance, supported by powers like Russia, China, and Iran, demonstrates that the era of uncontested U.S. primacy is coming to an end. Venezuela's ability to resist maximum pressure and obtain military and technological support from rival powers redefines the concept of deterrence. The future of global security will depend on how the U.S. adapts to this new multipolar reality, where military force alone is not enough to impose Washington's will. The crisis in the Caribbean is a somber reminder that the next war may be fought not only with missiles, but with sanctions, cyber attacks, and a war of narratives. The need for a diplomatic solution and the risk of error. Despite the military escalation, the only safe way out is diplomacy. However, the Trump administration uses negotiations as a tactic of war. The risk of a miscalculation or a lie turning into war is what keeps the world on edge. The last line of defense. Venezuela's preparation, including the arming of militias and the support of its allies, is the last line of defense. The success or failure of the U.S. incursion will depend on Venezuela's capacity for resistance and the willingness of its allies to intervene. The crisis in the Caribbean is a test of the U.S.'s ability to deal with a threat that is not low-hanging fruit.